So I'm going to go live now and start the recording. And without further ado, welcome to the August 2022 Greenhouse Talk. Um,
Also, Ben, if you're talking, you are muted right now.
yes. Okay, so I'll just restart the recording. Um, okay, so we're live on the YouTube stream, and welcome everyone to the Dendron August 2022 Greenhouse Talk. And now I'll hand off the mic to Kevin to introduce our speaker, Matt.
Sounds good. So with us today, so we have two people talking. First up will be Matt uh, Björner. I hope I'm saying the last name right. Great. So Matt is a maintainer of the TypeScript JavaScript in VS Code. If you've cut an issue to VS Code, you've probably interacted with Matt or have seen Matt around. And he's going to be giving a talk on the VS Code language server. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to Matt.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction. And let me just share my screen here. So I'm going to be talking all about the Markdown Language Server in VS Code, which is a new project that we, I don't want Discord Nitro, so I'll say go live here. And can everyone see that? Oh, okay, looking good. All right, yeah, so I'm going to be talking about the Markdown Language Server. And this is really a talk about Markdown tooling and how our thinking about Markdown tooling has sort of evolved. So first, a little bit about me. I have been working on VS Code for 6+ years now, which really it doesn't feel like it's been that long. So it's kind of surprising that it's been that long now. But the very first feature I actually took over when I was starting on VS Code was the Markdown support. So VS Code ships with a built-in Markdown extension. It has things like a Markdown preview, and then some Markdown tooling, which is what I'm going to be focusing on today. And that was the first thing I took over. So that was pretty cool. I also work on the JavaScript and TypeScript support, so all of the language tooling and interacting with the TypeScript team for that. And then a lot of stuff related to API. So if you go, it's things like web views, custom editors, the notebook support for Markdown, and code actions. And one of the cool things about the API is that my work on like features like Markdown and JavaScript and TypeScript has shaped some of the APIs that we ship. And then relevant for this talk, my work on things like JavaScript and TypeScript tooling has definitely influenced how I think about Markdown tooling. So let's talk a little bit about Markdown. Over the 6 years that I've been working on it, I've realized it's pretty good for the most part. It's readable, it's writable, it's widely used. So we're seeing Markdown used everywhere, everything from just simple little blurbs like one line comments they're writing on like something like Teams, for example, has adopted Markdown to entire websites, and all of the VS Code documentation, for example, is in Markdown. And then it's, for the most part, pretty simple. The exception to that, and what I've really had to deal with over the past 6 years, is that there are a lot of different flavors of Markdown. For a while, there was not really a good standard tracking Markdown. And then even once you settle on a different flavor of Markdown, there's a lot of different use cases where people are deploying Markdown to a server in one way or another way. So there's a lot of different things that we're having to support. So what about Markdown tooling? So this is really what we're going to be focusing on. And when I was looking into Markdown tooling, it's sort of the way I was thinking about Markdown tooling for a long time, is that Markdown is just text. So you don't really need very advanced tooling. And most of the Markdown tooling out there does focus on the text editing experience. So it might make headers larger, for example, to indicate that this is very easy to, or to make it really obvious that this is a header. It might have a little toolbar that's going to make making text bold, for example, easy. But these are all kind of things that you'd expect in like a basic text editing situation. And what I've sort of realized recently, and it kind of took me a long time to come around to this and really appreciate it, is that Markdown is more than just text. It's not just plain text that you're writing in an editor. It is actually structured text. And if it's structured, you can start doing some really interesting things with it. And that's really, so we have links, selections, all these different things that are actually adding structure to our text. And you can even have links between documents and create this entire graph. I'm sure all of this is not new if you're using Dendron, but for realizing this for normal Markdown files, it took me a little while to really appreciate this aspect of Markdown. That's where the Markdown Language Server is coming into play. So the Markdown Language Server is actually a project that is I think the core goal is to explore what's possible with Markdown tooling. But the first thing that we did as part of this is to take VS Code's Markdown tooling and make it reusable. So yeah, our core goal here, or our core goal here is that we want to apply some of the tools that are helping us write code quickly and safely to Markdown. And that's kind of going back to the first point I was mentioning, like because I've worked on the JavaScript and TypeScript support, I know what good tooling can look like for a programming language. And I started thinking, hey, wouldn't it be nice if we could apply a lot of this tooling over to Markdown as well? So being able to make changes, for example, with confidence, like when I rename a file, I shouldn't just break all the links to that file in my Markdown documentation. It should be easy for me to find the exact section of a Markdown document that I want to without having to know what file it's actually in. So these are all tools that we can, or that are implemented for programming languages, but aren't really available widely for Markdown today. And that's something that the language server is exploring. So just listing off a few of the features that are existing in the Markdown language server. So we have things like path completions if you're writing out links. We have things like a document outline, which is going to let you see both in the sidebar a little outline of your current document, and then also quickly jump to a header within the current file. You can go to a header within the entire workspace, so you don't really have to know what file it's in. We have smart folding, where it's looking at the different ranges in the document, so header sections in the document. Smart selection, which is doing the same, but letting you select things quickly. You can safely rename headers and links. So you can go to a header, press F2 on it, start a rename, type in the new name, and then when you press enter, any links to that header will also automatically be updated. And then on the experimental side, we have validation of Markdown links. So we can say, hey, this path to an image, that image doesn't actually exist on disk. And then we also recently got support for being able to update link files or moved around. And there's more that we're working on, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And the cool thing about the Markdown language server is that this project is now larger than VS Code itself. So all of these tools, or most of them, actually started in the VS Code core editor. But now with the language server, we're taking it and extracting all of these tools to a separate project that can then be consumed by other editors and tools. So this could be another text editor. So like Emacs has a language server plugin that lets it talk to language servers, for example. Or it could be a command line tool that somebody's going to build. And I think it's really exciting to think about all of the cases out there that you can kind of imagine, like having Markdown be used in other editors, but then to see what the community might do with the access to these tools when they can interact with Markdown in a more structured way. So I'm really excited to see what editors and tools are going to do with these features. So the project actually consists of two different open source projects. You can see the names on NPM here. The first one is the Markdown language service, and excuse me because the names are very confusing. They're very similar, but this is the actual JavaScript library that lets you interact with Markdown tooling. So this is where all the kind of logic for getting a document outline or finding a header in the workspace exists, and that's just a simple JavaScript library with a very generic API. The second part is the Markdown language server, and this is making use of the language server protocol. This basically just consumes the Markdown language service and exposes it on the language server protocol. And that's what, so depending on what your project needs are, you can choose to consume one or the other. But let's actually take a look at what all of this looks like in action. So I'm going to go and let's start here in the VS Code docs repository. So again, this is the VS Code docs repo. We have a whole lot of different Markdown files here. I think it was somewhere in the around 500 or 600 last time I checked. Let's just take a look at some of the different features that are being powered by the Markdown language server. Pretty much everything you're going to see is going to be powered by the language server here. So to start with, we have things like the document outline over in the side. So as I mentioned, if you can compute like what the structure of a document looks like, you can go and create an outline. So we can see all of the headers in the document. I can click on one to just go and jump over there. So I get this nice outline. That outline is also powering things like the go-to symbol or go-to header in file feature. So for this, I just pressed Control-Shift-O or Command-Shift-O, and now I can type in a header. So I could do something like search, go to the header I want, browse through the file, and quickly jump to that header. And then a more recent addition that's also powered by this feature, you notice as I'm scrolling through the file, up at the very top, it's having these sticky lines. This is the editor sticky scroll feature, and it's also powered by the document outline. So as I'm scrolling through, notice how it'll let me know what section I'm in, and then I can click on that header up there just to jump back to the top of that section. So I'm able to very easily just glance at the top of my editor here and know what section I'm in. Now, some of the other things that I talked about, we can jump to a header somewhere in the current workspace. So if I just say Control T or Command T here, I can say something like IntelliSense, and it's going to now index the entire workspace and go across all the different Markdown files and find all of the headers that have IntelliSense somewhere in the name. So here I can go and find the one that I'm after here and just go jump to that specific header within that file. So again, you don't have to actually know what file you're looking in. You can just sort of remember, hey, there's a header with this term somewhere in there. So I'm going to go jump over to that. We can do things like folding. So folding based on the header sections here. Notice that when I click on the little folding icon, it's going to collapse down the header section, and then I can expand it again. Or I could collapse down the entire header section here if I wanted to. And that's also going to be used for smart selection. So here I'm going to start on a word, and I'm going to use the expand selection command to first select the entire paragraph, then the entire body of the header section, then the entire section, and eventually the entire body of the header section above. So all of these are being powered by the language server. And these are features that you do need to have some sort of smarts for because we're actually analyzing the structure of the document and doing intelligent things based on that. Now, a few more things to quickly demonstrate here. We have clickable document links. So if I wanted to jump to a different file, like let's say I wanted to go and view this image, I can just go and press follow link, open up that image. This also works to other Markdown files. So here you'll notice that I'm linking to a Markdown file, and I'm linking to a specific header within that Markdown file. I can click on that, and it's gone and jumped to that header in the other file. So this is letting you stay in your Markdown editor without having to go to the Markdown preview to actually go and navigate through links. We have things like path completions. So if I go in and let's say I was wanting to create a link to somewhere else in the current file, I could just type the little pound sign here. I get a list of all the headers that I can link to in the current file. And I can say something like search again, just press enter. So it was able to complete the path there. This even works for other files. So if I go in here and actually start typing, you can see it's suggesting headers within that other file. And then if I go back here and trigger completions with control space, it's actually going to start suggesting different path segments. So I can go and find the exact image or path that I'm after here very easily. And again, these are all features that are kind of more like what you'd expect from a programming language, but they end up being extremely helpful in Markdown. For path completions, that's something that we didn't have for like the first 5 years I was working on Markdown. And I just got really fed up with always misspelling paths. So I added it, and then I couldn't believe that it had taken so long to ever add this before. Now, getting into a few more advanced use cases here. So let's say that I wanted to go and find all the places where a file in the workspace is referenced. I could just put my cursor up here on the path and say, find all references. I might need to go to a different version of VS Code here. I think I might be on a broken build. So I'm going to go and pull up a different one here and go to the top again, zoom in, ignore that error message, and we're going to go do the exact same thing. So here I have the key bindings file. My cursor is on that currently. And I'm going to say find all references, and it's going to go and index through the entire workspace to find all the places where that file is being linked to. The first time it does that, it's going to be a little bit slow because it is actually looking at all the Markdown files. But in the future, this would actually be much quicker. So I can just navigate through all the different references. Again, this is letting us start to think about Markdown more as structured text or structured files that has all these links in sort of like a graph of different documents. Now, let's look at one more thing here. Let's say I was wanting to rename one of the headers in the Markdown file. Again, this is kind of talking about making Markdown editing safe. I can just press F2 here and add something new. And notice how the link down here has also updated. Now, if I wanted to, I could also go and update one of the files here. So I could actually type a new file name. And this is going to update all of the links to that file, and then also update all of the places where that file is being referenced. So if I go over here, I can start, not that one. Let's go to this one. You can see that this one has now gone and updated all the links to that file across all links in the current workspace. And then getting into the more experimental features I mentioned, if I go and introduce an error here, it's a little hard to see with the different underlines, but it is actually saying, hey, this file does not exist at the path. So it is able to clue me into these errors. And then some of the other things we're working on are related to when I rename a file in the Explorer, VS Code should automatically update those as well. And again, all these are being powered by the language server. I'm just demonstrating them using VS Code. So that is a quick demo of the current features. But let's actually quickly look at how this was all implemented. So this is getting back to what I was mentioning before, where all the logic for Markdown was previously existing in a VS Code extension. So we have VS Code at the bottom. there's the Markdown extension, which was built in. We're using Markdown it for the parsing. And then each of the little pink boxes you can imagine as being different features that we're exposing to the user. And VS Code was talking to the extension using the standard VS Code extension API. So that's what you can find if you just create a new VS Code extension. So this is the world before, but to create the language server, we actually had to create a separate process. So the Markdown language server is its separate process. It actually communicates with the language server protocol. And you could actually replace the entire left side of this diagram with a different editor that would also talk the language server protocol. And hopefully everything would just keep on working. We haven't been able to test that quite in every editor implementation yet, but that's the goal at least. So in phase one, we just introduced the Markdown language server and the language server protocol, along with the Markdown language service. And that, again, you can see how the language server is just consuming the language service to implement different things. So that was the first phase. Then we actually started moving over individual features like document outlines. And eventually we moved over all of the different features. And we were able to do this incrementally. So it would have been quite a lot of work to go directly to this end state. But because we could move over each of these features one at a time, we were able to do this incrementally, have feedback when we broke something, and achieve all of this over the course of one or two iterations or one or two releases for VS Code, hopefully without anybody noticing that everything had suddenly moved over to a language server. One of the other fun benefits of having the language server is that everything is running in a separate process as well. So for link validation, for example, that can be a little bit costly. And now it's running as a separate process, which won't stall the main VS Code extension. So what is next for Markdown tooling? So these projects are both open source. We're really looking for getting other people to test them out, try using them in their editor or tool. And then we're also really interested in contributions. I think one of the reasons why we built this is that we want to build a shared effort around Markdown tooling. And that's recognizing that, yes, we're making our code available to everyone else, but if others start contributing to that, that will also ultimately benefit VS Code. We've seen a lot of benefit for this on other open source projects with VS Code. So that is why we've made these projects open source. We're also exploring things like quick fixes and organizing definitions and other things that, again, are things you might find in a programming language, but bringing them over to Markdown. So those are some of the things that we're thinking about. So my call to action is that if you're interested in Markdown tooling, let's build the future of Markdown tooling together. I think we've only just started to explore what is really possible. It's really exciting to see some of these new features. There's definitely been a lot more progress in the past couple of months in VS Code's Markdown tooling than I think there's been in the past couple of years. And I think some of the features that we're starting to explore now are things that have not been widely available before. So it's really cool to see these starting to ship. Some of them are going to be things that everybody can benefit from, such as path completions, and other ones are going to be things that only really advanced users are interested in. But I'm really excited for what we're going to accomplish with these two projects here. So thank you. And if anybody has any questions, I can try to answer those. You can find both of those projects on GitHub. There's also a blog post that I can share in the channel that will talk a little bit more about the Markdown language server development process and why we actually went about building it. And then if you're interested in following me on Twitter, you can just go to @MattBierner. I post about VS Code with VS Code tips and then updates on Markdown somewhat regularly. So thank you. I will stop sharing.
Thank you, Matt, for the talk. And as somebody that follows Matt on Twitter, I can attest that he does post tips quite regularly, and they are quite helpful. So now we have the Q&A phase. If you guys have questions, since we have a number of people here, I would say if you can type it out in the chat, and then me and Ben can kind of moderate and also forward them. So in the Tea Time channel, there is a chat. Yes, and while people are thinking of things to ask or getting the thoughts together, I wanted to take this moment to ask Matt, as somebody that has worked with the JavaScript TypeScript ecosystem, I find it like fitting that you're working on Markdown, because I kind of think of Markdown as in JavaScript. Like it is the most inexplicable in terms of what should have won. Like there's no reason why JavaScript should be the dominant language it is today, but it is. And so we work at it, and then TypeScript kind of papers over a lot of the bad parts. Similarly, I kind of think of Markdown as, it was the spec, it was a language that had no spec besides a blog post. There's no single standard of it. For all the technical reasons, like there are many better alternatives to Markdown, but like JavaScript, Markdown is now everywhere. And I'm wondering if there is a similar analogy to like what TypeScript is to JavaScript. Is there something for Markdown? Is that something that you have any thoughts on?
Yeah, I think it's kind of an interesting one. I wonder if you could make a safer Markdown syntax, like going with TypeScript, where you're actually introducing types or some sort of additional syntax to make JavaScript safer. What we're kind of doing here, though, is actually a little bit like what we support for JavaScript, where you can have TypeScript go and type check it. So you can just turn on a flag in VS Code, and it will start type checking your JavaScript files and try to infer types as best as possible without you having to modify your original JavaScript. And I can see that is pretty similar. Like we will try to do our best job to understand what you're doing with your JavaScript. And in this case, we're trying to do our best to understand what you're doing with your Markdown. There's also things you can do in your Markdown or in your JavaScript to make it a little bit safer for us, to make it easier for us to understand what is going on. So I think that parallel actually might kind of exist there. We don't want to introduce any new syntax. And right now, these projects are both targeting just standard common mark. So they don't necessarily support all of the more advanced features that some Markdown flavors are introducing, like wiki links and other things. But it might be interesting to explore if we could extend support for that in the future.
Got it. Thanks, Matt. Does anyone have any questions? And you can also unmute and also just ask it in the channel.
So, as it happens, Matt. Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
You go.
Yeah, go
Go
for it,
ahead,
Jamie.
Jamie. Yeah.
Okay, so Kevin, in reference to Markdown, I actually had some problems a few weeks ago after an update, and I was wondering if there's an official extension that should be used with Discord for Markdown or best Markdown functionality, because I try to install the package, the extension that came with Discord. I mean, with Jesus Christ, my brain is fried. With the tool, with your extension, basically, and it wasn't working until I uninstalled and reinstalled a couple of times, and then it worked after a while. So I was wondering if there's an actual official extension that we should be using with Dendron.
I think for that, I think it goes kind of to like there's a lot of Markdown tooling available in VS Code, and depending on what features of like the language API it hooks into, they can conflict with each other. Right. And so some things, like a popular extension that unfortunately does conflict with Dendron is like the Markdown all-in-one, because it's quite aggressive about some auto-completion for like bulleted list. So I'll send you a link, but we do have like a list of like conflicting extensions that can be problematic. But I guess that also makes me think of like, I guess it is quite common for like, there is a case of like different language tooling overlapping or stepping on each other because they're doing a lot of the same functionality. And I guess this makes me want to ask you, Matt, like, is there any does the VS Code team have any guidance or any like recommendations about multiple extensions working on the same language?
Yeah, it's tricky, and it sort of varies by what feature you're talking about. So if it's something like go to symbol in workspace, for example, where you just want to see every symbol that exists in the entire workspace, we could have multiple extensions all providing that and just show every symbol that's returned and just combine the results. But let's say it's a formatter. Now, if you have multiple formatting extensions installed, you probably want to just run one of them because they might conflict with each other and end up undoing or redoing each other's work. So that's not a great experience. It's so for each language feature, it's sort of handled on a case-by-case basis. And then some extensions might provide like hooks or other things that you can go and hook into to customize different behavior. So HTML and CSS, the built-in extensions in VS Code, will go and they expose some extension points that let you say, hey, here's some custom tags that are going to be returned for completions. That also has to be handled on a case-by-case basis, though. For the Markdown support today, we are sort of trying to target just generic common mark, and then the hope is that people can then build their custom support on top of that. So they could have a wrapper that goes and adds support for wiki links or syntax or like path completion inside of code blocks, for example, or all these other things that might not make sense for this core project, but might be helpful in their case. So we sort of think this would be like the base layer that you could then build other things on top of. And because it is a library for the Markdown language service service, for example, that is something that you can either choose to call different functions in our thing. You can modify the results as you get them back. So you can really customize things if you have a specific use case in mind. But no, I'm sorry, there's not like a great like single answer for this.
Yeah, I figured, and no, that's great. Thanks. Ben, I think, or Jamie, did you have a follow-up?
No, thanks. I was going to say thanks. I was just wondering because I tried different things to get that working. The Markdown preview worked after I uninstalled and reinstalled a couple of times, but it's good. Thanks. Understand.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, like uninstall, reinstall, restart. That's like uh, the universal solve. Ben, you were going to ask something.
Yeah, I mean, what I was going to ask about is mostly what you just addressed, right? That there's this explosion, as you hinted in your intro slides, there's an explosion of Markdown dialects and flavors, and I was going to ask, is there going to be some sort of wrapper interface or some sort of plugin interface with the language server for accommodating those somehow? And I hear from you that there's an incipient stage of that. That's kind of the general plan, but there's nothing specific yet. Do I have the right sense of that?
Yes, yeah, I think that's correct. We actually do allow this for TypeScript. So you can have a TypeScript server plugin that will, it lets you intercept any of the calls and either replace them completely. So let's say I was getting completions in a TypeScript file. Your plugin could go and completely replace the results. It could go and modify the results in some way. And I could see something like that being something we support for Markdown in the future. One of the challenges with this architecture is that people that are writing things for VS Code, like Dendron is a VS Code extension right now, they would not be able to use any of the VS Code APIs if they were a little plugin, because this is now all running as a generic process that can't call any of those VS Code APIs directly. So that would be a little bit of a challenge. And we'd also have to come up with a good interface and also give users a way to know that there is some plugin that's modifying their results. We've seen quite a few instances where a misbehaving TypeScript plugin will end up crashing our TypeScript support, and then people end up blaming VS Code and saying, "Hey, why is VS Code so buggy?" When really it's the plugin that's doing something bad.
Well, I'm certainly really excited to start playing around with this, and of course to see things coming up in the wilds, making use of all this. So thank you again for coming here and giving a talk on this.
Yeah, and as they're working on this, if you run into any problems where you're realizing, hey, like we can't customize or replace the response as expected for some VS Code API, like let's say you wanted to completely override path completions or find all references or something like that. If you're running into cases like that, please open an issue too. There might be a way to do it that is maybe not as obvious, or it might be something that we could consider as a feature request. So all this is still evolving. This is kind of just the first phase, and I'm really excited to see what ends up happening as we move this project forward.
Yeah, likewise. And I feel like you will probably see issues, at least from our side, in the not distant future. All right. Any other questions? All right. If not, we'll also have a link to the notes as well as any resources and links that Matt has talked about in the uh, event detail page. And we'll also be posting a recording of this afterwards as well. All right. Then in that case, Ben, do you want to introduce me for the next part?
Okay, yes. So the next segment of the greenhouse will be led by Kevin Lin, the founder of Dendron. Uh,
Uh,
and we
all right.
actually didn't speak in advance on what you'd be talking about, but so you'll be able to introduce that yourself.
All right, will do. And also, just thanks again, Matt, for the great talk on the Markdown Language Server, as well as the work on top of it. And for my talk, I'll be talking about something a lot more on the application layer, which it's about summarizing documentation as devs or for developers. And so for this talk, just to begin, I want to describe this technique called progressive summarization. It's used a lot when summarizing text. It was introduced by Tiago Forte, who's this big influencer in the PKM space. But it's this idea that as you read text, you want to be able to retain some of it so that you can use it again in the future. And so how can you make it so that every time you go over a piece of text, you can leave being better prepared the next time you use it? And just a slight overview of how the technique goes on regular text is it's divided into different layers, which represents like different passes you do. So the first time you read a text, you might just take excerpts from it. The second time you go over it, you will like bold things that stand out and then highlight. But the idea is that every single time you make another pass at the text, the next time you do it, you're not starting off from scratch. You're building upon the work that you have done before. And it becomes easier and easier to make use of the pertinent information as you make passes through the text. And what does this have to do with development? The typical like flow for a dev is looking up text. You're looking up documentation, you're looking up RFCs, you're looking up stuff on Stack Overflow, but it is just this constant barrage of looking up information all the time. And the typical workflow can go like this. You have a problem, you Google it, that probably takes you to Stack Overflow. You copy paste some solution or you work around some solution, and then you cycle on to the next problem. And you do this over and over. And what's the problem here? The problem here is that, while that might give you a result, like while that may get you to the next task, you end up doing the same things again and again. You never build mastery over the software, the tools, the things that you're using. This is kind of akin to imagine you're trying to navigate and go home, and use Google Maps to find your way home every single day. You're navigating the same route, but because you are completely reliant on the map software to take you home, you never actually know where your home is. And all you've really learned is the ability to follow instructions. And one of the big themes I see from a lot of developers is this idea of like, once you get started, how do I get better at my job? How do I advance? How do I upskill, up level? And I would say like one of the big problems is that it's hard to advance when a lot of the knowledge, a lot of the experience you do on your day-to-day becomes a problem of searching for information that you're going to forget, like at the next day or the next month. And if this is such a problem, like, why don't we do it? Why don't we try to like have a deeper understanding of the technologies that we use? But the problem here is just like is that software is overwhelming. There's too much information and there's too much churn of the existing information. You think you know how React works? Well, then there's hooks. You think you got used to that? Now there's concurrency. Things change all the time, and you have deadlines, and your manager tells you that you have deadlines. And JavaScript is just a mess that is changing all the time. And so it's also very hard to be able to have some sort of sane way of building mastery on this stuff because at any given time you could be working on um, many dozens of different technologies, some of which you're evaluating, some of them which you'll use again, most of them you don't. And so this is where the technique for progressive summarization can be very useful, but applying it to documentation. Now, what I like to tell people, or the thing that I usually rant about is, um, if I spend more than 5 minutes working on something, then I never want to spend those same 5 minutes working on the same problem. And so the question is, how does this actually work in practice? How can we actually apply this? And so for this, I'm going to switch to the demo part of this presentation and go into my Dendron workspace. So let's take a look. So first, if you guys can all see this, this is my, going back to the beginning, typically when you're progressively summarizing text, you make a few passes at it, and every time you get more and more detailed. And I've made an example of what the different levels can look like when you're trying to document code, at least what I do when I document code. And the example is, let's say you're using grep for the first time, and you go to a man page and you try to understand how grep works. Now, the first time you use it, this is an example of how I would keep my note, is I would add a URI to the site where I got the information from. In this case, it's a Linux man page. And then just include an example. This is, for example, how I've been using it in the command line. And what this serves is just as a hook. So the next time if I am using grep, if I'm on the same page, the URI helps as a key to help me figure out, have I looked at this before? And this is a good trigger of like the basic, how do I use this command? And so this is level one, just getting the note and getting an excerpt. Now, the second pass at it, if I find I'm using grep again and again, what I'll try to do is I'll try to add more details to the text. So in this case, it's instead of just a generic, what did I find on the internet? What are personal insights that I have about using grep? What did I run into? What are hard-won nuggets of knowledge? And so for this, I usually like to add a gotcha section. And so for gotchas, like one thing that gets me about grep is that if you set flags, those flags have to be before the pattern. In Linux, it's not very consistent about this. Some commands do it after the pattern, it's fine. Some before, it's fine. But for example, this is something that, for me personally, I keep forgetting. So it's something that I now add in gotchas. And then if you notice also, I've added in options sections. And the goal of this is I don't want to copy and paste the man page. Like the man page is there, I can just use that. The point of this note is just, how do I use grep and how is it useful to me? And so at level 2, what it becomes about is, what are my personal insights for using grep and what are the options that I end up using? And then, a lot of my notes, they will stop at level 1, and sometimes I'll get to level 2. But if I find myself continuing to use a particular tool, then we get to level 3. And so at level 3, what I start to do is, instead of having a single note, I start to break it apart. And so, I have this node on grep. I might continue to adding more options, more of the gotchas, but then I'll also expand from that. So like a cookbook. So like common recipes of like more complicated things I do with the grep command. So in this case, the example here is like, oh, how do I find like if I'm scanning over like a huge file that is a single line, how do I only find like certain bytes of context? Well, like files that don't match. But at this point, I will have expanded beyond a single node and started building out relations to more advanced topics and more deeper levels of usage of this particular tool. And then, after this, the level 4 phase of this, I call it the passing it forward. It's, at this point, I've used grep for a while, but I also realized that I use a whole bunch of other command line tools. And so trying to think about how do I want to structure the way that I organize my knowledge about command line tools. Now, the following here, this is more Dendron specific, but you can do this in any text editor. So in Dendron, just as a refresher, we have this concept of a schema. And so the schema helps you define how you want your notes to be structured. And so in this case, it's saying anything I put under the CLI hierarchy, CLIs can have subcommands, they can have environmental variables, they can have a cookbook section. And so this is just something that I want to start documenting and enforcing for when I add a new note that is of a CLI tool. And then something else is there's like a template attached. And so like for template, it's just like, okay, when I create a new CLI document, then these are some like common sections that I want to add. And to see like an example of how this actually looks like in practice, you can see, for example, this is my actual knowledge base. And so this is over here, I have my actual grep note. And there's, it has some children, but by going through the process of creating a template and the schema, it's this idea that, okay, now if I want to document, if I come across a new CLI tool, let's say it's a VS Code CLI. When I create it, it comes with this template already. And then I can also, if I need to expand beyond a single node, I have a kind of directive, a structure of how I want to think about that. So the last one is a little bit more Dendron specific, but it's more just the way that I think about progressive summarization for docs is this idea. In the beginning, you just want to capture it. Just capture the pertinent parts, and it should answer the question of like, have I done this before? Like, have I worked with this tool before? And then if you find yourself continuing to use it, the idea is of adding details. So in level 2, adding things that you've learned from your own usage of the tool. And if you continue to use it, then expanding beyond a node, adding additional sections and subsections. And then if this is a common category of like software that you use, like thinking about the structure of that, like how do you want to catalog that, organize it, and expand it. And so going back to the presentation, so what we just went through is like using grep, the CLI tool. Some other of my conventions that I found useful. I have a V package hierarchy. This is for essentially every software package that I use. So this thing of if it's an npm package, if it's a Python package, if it's like an open source project, if I've spent more than 5 minutes trying to figure it out, I have a note on it in my knowledge base. And then I also have a service hierarchy. And a service hierarchy is just something I don't have the source code access to. So something like Google search. If I try to like do some Google advanced search syntax, if I figured out that in G Suite you can only cancel a group by like going to this obscure admin interface, then this is where I will document it. And some parting thoughts. Today, especially when you work in technology, the information that we deal with on a regular basis can feel overwhelming. And often, there's this idea of like, why even bother? Like, why should I even bother like trying to understand things if it's just going to change the next day? And I would say like the really hard thing about software is unlike um, it's not a fixed target. And so there's a wide breadth of lots of different concepts that change all the time. Languages, frameworks, technologies, web development. And it's simply not possible to hold this stuff in your head. And so I think this is like where kind of like this, like, why even bother? We'll just Google it. And the goal of this talk is to show an alternative where you don't have to resign yourself to following Google Maps every day. You can get a sense of what you can get a sense for the underlying tools. You can get a sense for patterns and mental models for how you should think about it, and develop a system in which every time you end up using something, even if you don't understand the fundamentals, you are able to walk away with a little bit more understanding, with a little bit more mastery than you were when you first started. And so this process, this workflow of progressively summarizing documentation and technologies that I'm using is one example of how I do this in my workflow. All right. Thanks, everyone, for listening. And now, are there any questions?
So Kevin, I had a question about there's an older piece you wrote, and it was titled "A Hierarchy First Approach to Knowledge Management," and it's one of my favorite pieces, one that I keep linking people to. And I was noticing the similarities in the approach you described there and what you just showed us. And I was wondering, how is your approach to knowledge management? Because you were talking about programming languages in that post as your primary example. So I was curious, how has your approach changed since then, and what's remained the same?
Um, yeah, so I'll put a link also, or if you can get the link. In terms of that original article of a hierarchy first approach to knowledge management, just as a quick summary, that is this idea that it is useful when you're dealing with lots of information, it is useful to collapse them into hierarchies of common things so that instead of thinking of a million things, you're just thinking of like a few things. And the example of programming languages is instead of trying to think about how to do like various different things in 10 different programming languages, just thinking about programming languages itself, like having the mental model of what is the programming language, and then understanding that, and then mapping everything onto that hierarchy so that instead of tracking 10 languages, you're just tracking like your mental model for programming languages. So I think that piece resonated with a lot of people, but also I think one of the things that has also come through is like that seems great once you can form that mental model, and it's really useful, but it seems like it requires a lot of investment. And also most of the things that I do day to day, it's not navigating programming languages. It's this very almost shallow, like I need to look up how something works. I need to figure out how this function called does. And so today's talk, this idea about progressive summarization is this idea of how to get from here to there, or that you don't actually need to get there. This idea that a hierarchy can just be 2 levels deep. Like as long as you just have some structure of categorizing your knowledge, of being able to tell have I seen this before? What do I know about it? And how can I add to it? As long as you can answer those questions and do that pretty fast, then you can build the system. And so I guess the way of thinking about today's talk in relation to that original piece about hierarchical knowledge management is this idea that you don't need much to get started. You don't need anything to get started. As long as you just decide that there is some sort of convention you want to follow and then you stick to that, you can incrementally build up, your knowledge of how things work. And that this works, like that this is a process that can carry you through from the beginning to the end.
So it really embodies the amoeba concept that we love so much around here. I mean, it it occurred to me that it's not just progressive summarization of information, but actually progressive differentiation, as in how you use the tool specifically, and then breaking it up further into all of your specific use cases, and then from that integrating and abstracting into. So I thought that was really cool. So if there aren't more questions from other people, I have more of my own, but I don't want to fill up the room, so I'll just take a moment here.
I just want to thank Kevin again for another very helpful talk here, because it's something that I've been thinking about. I actually picked up Forta's book because of that, the knowledge management, because of the fact that we get, like you said, we do a lot of research, we look at material, and it's capturing that. And that's why I migrated to Dendron, because it was a nice way to categorize things and start structuring our notes and capturing information. So this is kind of ties into that. So I appreciate, again, all the good stuff that you're putting out. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. Glad you find it useful.
So, oh,
Oh, hey, I just had one question. I copped in here a little bit late, but yeah, thanks. That was a cool talk. I want to try that leveling thing out in my own notes. From my perspective, I use Dendron a lot in like a shared knowledge-based context. So one thing that I thought of in your presentation is that, you have nodes on things like grep, npm, etc. And those are things that, for example, those are things that would be useful for me, but in a way I didn't put in that effort to, potting those down and forming those structures myself, so I might not map to that knowledge base as well. So I guess my question is, like, if you're on a team or something, or you use Dendron in some shared way, do you feel that it's beneficial to document on things that would be shared knowledge, like, we all use grep, we all use Docker, etc., or is that kind of against the self-augmenting way of just doing it yourself, finding your own paths, and like going your own road with it, I guess, instead of trying to like impose structures in the way that you think and learn and associate concepts on like other people who are in your shared knowledge base. A little bit of a broad question, but just something I
Yeah.
was thinking about.
Yeah, it's actually very relevant, so thanks for bringing it up. I do think that how we understand topics and concepts, it's very personal. I think, a while back, I asked 10 different people of how they like organized like their information, and I got 10 different responses. And like the system works well for them, but it was also like different from other people's. And and at the end of the day, it's like if we're talking about PKM, so like personal knowledge management, like the system that will work best is the system that you know, the system that you're familiar with. And even though there are similarities, it might not necessarily map on to someone else's thinking of that. But that being said, there is also a lot of benefit for having like a shared understanding of how something is organized. And so like if you think about this in code bases, it's, we've adopted certain patterns like model view controller, or like the visitor pattern, or the singleton pattern. And the idea is that, if we are able to speak the same language, if we have the same kind of mental framework, then it becomes easier for us to work
Right.
with the information that other people have put down. So I think in a shared knowledge base, that is also true. For example, like inside of Dendron, all our packages, and I can show this, all our packages have the and apologies if the screen is a little small, but all our personal packages have the package prefix. And so if you want to, for example, look up the information on any piece of software that we have, you can look under the package hierarchy. And then, for example, if you want to know how do I get started on any package, then it's quick start. And so every single package inside of Dendron, it's documented in the same way. And so if you're a team member that was working on the plugin and is now working on the CLI, you already know how to look for the information you need because that information is already there. And so going back to your question, I think having common mental models, common hierarchies to navigate your knowledge base, it's useful for teams and individuals. The difference I would say is as a team, as an individual, you can have your custom hierarchy for everything. And because it's yours, you can kind of manage it. But you have to be more, you have to pick and choose more in a team because people have a more limited kind of time as well as attention. And so the difference would be in your personal knowledge base, you might have, hundreds of hierarchies and going into arbitrary depths. Like in our team knowledge base, we only have these hierarchies for like team packages, for playbooks, for like specific procedures, but like for individual commands, for individual like third-party projects, those are not something we would keep in the team knowledge base just because people have different ways of thinking about that.
Okay, gotcha. So yeah, that definitely makes sense, and those are some good examples. Yeah, another thing that I've thought about doing is like, I guess you just have to decide on like what stuff is relevant to the context of your team and like what stuff is more specific to like your own personal knowledge base. I'd also thought of just like doing most things under like my own hierarchy or my own personal knowledge management and just like kind of cherry picking them over, so to speak, into the shared one for where it makes sense. But okay, cool. Yeah, thanks for answering that.
Yeah, and the idea of cherry picking into the team knowledge base, it's kind of like this progressive summarization talk, just like taken in a different context. I think it's better to start off small and with a defensible base when it comes to your team knowledge management kind of scenario. So like try just documenting your packages consistently and not do anything else. And only when that is something that the entire team can get behind, then do you introduce other things as well. But start small and then expand when it makes sense to you or when you find that, a piece of information needs to be shared.
Okay, very cool. Good advice. Thank you.
Welcome.
A quick question on hierarchy since we're talking about evolving the PKM. I noticed that sometimes we use the links to reference images and possibly docs, but using Markdown files in a docs folder within our vault. How is that? Would you say would you advise against that, or would you prefer to have all the notes just under the vault root, or is it okay to you think it's to put them under separate folders under the vault and reference those as links?
Are you talking about images or notes?
Notes that are. I guess I'm trying to think of if there's any performance issues or with putting everything under one vault versus multi-vault versus maybe some other folder hierarchies. I mean, I don't know if there's any issues with that.
So generally, what we advise is like you can split things out if you have. It's usually comes down to like permissions. If you have like documents that you want to publish publicly and documents that you want to not publish publicly, then that would be a good place to have different vaults. But if you're just concerned about like, I need to store a bunch of files, like we have vaults at like tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands, or most recently, I think we found somebody had over 1 million docs. So it's not a problem of just keeping a lot of notes under a vault.
Okay, thanks.
Mhm.
One more question I had was because you described a process where you sort of increase and grow and differentiate the notes by progressively using these tools and doing those 5-minute searches for information that you need. And I was wondering, is there some sort of complementary process for removing or deleting or refining or discarding information that is no longer relevant, that is no longer needed?
Um, yeah, it's a great point. It's actually something I've been thinking about because today that is not really part of my workflow. Like once something gets added, it just stays there. It generally hasn't been a problem because when I look for information, I can either when I look for information, like all that extra mass doesn't bother me. I just don't surface it because I'm not trying to, like, I'm not searching through my whole knowledge base. I'm just looking for the information that I need. The information that I'm not using kind of just sits there. Something, so nothing on that yet. Something I have been thinking about is like keeping statistics around, like, when was the last time this node was used? Or even like when was the last time like text from a certain section of a note was copied, or like uh, so to help with like pruning in the future. But as of today, there isn't much of a pruning process. At least not one that I do on a consistent basis. Maybe like once a quarter, I will like take a look and figure out, do some things still serve me? If not, I like move them over to like an archive vault that I have. But in general, it's not been part of my day to day.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense that like if you have a legible structure that scales, like you were talking about, then the cost of looking things up is so low that uh, there isn't much to be lost from keeping things around. Okay, so it's been about an hour since our start time, um, and I don't see any further questions. So would it make sense for us to call it here?
Yeah, I think it would. Thank you, everybody, for attending the greenhouse. And if anybody has any follow-ups or think of something after the fact, you're always free to post in tea time, or just message. And the recording notes and everything else from both the talks of today will be made available by sometime next week. So you'll be able to catch it there as well.
Okay. So one more comment coming in. Both of these have been great. The questions too. Thanks everyone. Uh, Zimin says thank you. And so with that, I'll officially close this August 2022 Greenhouse Talk.